Welcome, Hotshots, to Flashlight by Firepower X. Here you can find the industrial strength tools you need to dominate your personal and professional wellness. My name is Jess. I'm boss lady here at Firepower X, former firefighter, and your host for today's webinar. And I'm super stoked to introduce a very special guest today, Mr. Todd Bevans, paramedic, firefighter, soldier, educator living in Boise, Idaho, with 22 years of service to the fire and EMS community. And prior to Idaho, he worked and volunteered in Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. He's also a combat medic for the Idaho Army National Guard and a wilderness medicine instructor for the National Outdoor Leadership School. Welcome, Todd. I'm so glad to have you here today on the show.
It's awesome to finally do this with you.
I know it is. We're going to have a really great conversation. And I want to start with, dude, you wear a lot of hats. As I was, internet stalking you for all of the fine detail, for the many hats you wear, what is the common thread between all of this stuff that you do?
That's a good question. I don't think I've even managed to get a semblance of a handle on the answer for that, especially in the past 22 years of doing this.
Mhm.
I I guess there are multiple things about public safety and service that I enjoy, that I nerd about, and there's only so much of those different desires that I have that you could get from one employer. So I just keep sort of spreading myself thin among multiple other employers, as I try to, I don't know, as I try to fill my plate of what that desire meal looks like, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
I love my job working as a paramedic full time, but I still love firefighting as well. So that led me to working part time as a firefighter paramedic in another agency. Then I
Mhm.
like to teach, so that's where Knowles comes into play. And
Mhm.
then I've always wanted to toy with the idea of the military. My dad was in the army; he was a Vietnam veteran. He did 20 years as a commissioned officer. And the idea of doing search and rescue and aviation while also wearing the uniform of a U.S. soldier was a really big deal to me. So I
Mhm.
joined the Idaho Army National Guard with the idea of, yeah, maybe one day I'll get to work as a flight paramedic doing search and rescue as well, like cover all those desires as well. So I guess that's what led me to my four jobs today.
Mhm.
Um,
Because you've
that made,
you've also done helitac too, haven't you? At some point, you did
yeah,
some helitac, yeah.
I did 2 years of Helltech with Zion National Park for the short stint that they had a Helltech crew.
Hmm. And you're a parent, right?
Yeah, I have a 16-year-old,
Hmm.
16-year-old daughter that's driving. That's pretty fun. It's actually a really fun. It's a fun age to be a parent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you I I can't imagine that you have a car with a brake on your side as well as her side. So how did driver training go?
She does not. So her name's Malia. She does
Hmm.
not like driving my truck whatsoever. She
Hmm.
she thinks it's too big. Which again, for me, I always laugh. It's like it's Toyota Tacoma. It's not that big.
Hmm.
She thinks it's way too big in comparison to her mom's Jeep, and she just does not like it. I had to bribe her the very first time she got behind the wheel of my new Tacoma. I had to
Hmm.
bribe her. I had to physically bribe her. It was an argument for 10 minutes while she was like just dying on her hill that she was not going to drive that car. So I finally bribed her to
Hmm.
drive 2 miles.
Hmm.
And yeah, she took my money, ran with it, and decided not to drive the rest of the way to where we were trying to go. So
Whoops.
yeah. But I mean, she's pretty responsible. I have a lot of trust and faith in her. It's just a matter of getting her to have a little faith in herself and her driving skills. So
Hmm. Yeah, it can be intimidating, I think, when you're first learning, just that
oh,
muscle
absolutely,
memory isn't there yet.
exactly.
So, awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that with you. And I kind of want to bring it back to, you got a lot on your plate.
Mm.
So, why is mental health the topic kind of important to you? Why does it matter?
The very first time I decided to start filling my plate was at a period of my life where I recognized that I was having a lot of issues. And instead of addressing those issues, I just wanted to work. I figured that if I worked, I didn't have to focus on those issues. If I'm working, I'm not thinking about those issues. I can leave them at home or wherever it is that they are. And just by the very nature of work, whether it's call volume, training, whatever productive tasks that we have for the day, I can just simply avoid those problems. And I think now there are days where I still do that. And we talked briefly before we started recording. My mother died on April 14th of this year, and that's been something I've been struggling with for months. And I feel that I reverted back to trying to disassociate from my own issues by simply filling my plate with work.
Hmm.
And thankfully, I went years without doing that. I
Hmm.
found a way to deal with my own issues. I was going to regular therapy. I finally established a personality and a life that did not revolve around my profession, which at least me personally, my own opinion, is probably one of the healthiest things that I can do, that anyone can do
Hmm.
as a firefighter or a paramedic or an EMT or insert job title here.
Hmm.
Uh, that, for about 10 years, I stopped trying to fill my plate with work in order to avoid whatever insecurities, whatever mental hangups, whatever trauma I was trying to avoid once I was not at work, once I wasn't focused on something else aside from myself.
Hmm.
Um, that's it's really the only thing I can think of as to why I've spread myself so thin over my entire career, pretty much.
Hmm. And you kind of mentioned when we were talking off camera about your mother's passing, which I'm my condolences. Losing a parent, I think, is a really challenging thing. Um, you mentioned that you kind of um, had found some sort of base or foundation while you through your grief. So can you kind of unpack that for us?
Sure. I feel that any of us that work in fire and EMS, any of us that work in fire and EMS, we're surrounded by death. It's an inevitable part of our job. We can't escape it. And through whether you handle it well or whether it's something that you find traumatic that you have to seek out therapy for, or maybe even just simply, initial psychological first aid. You The more you're exposed to death, the closer you come to understanding it and how it's a part of our life, how it's a part of our culture, and also culturally how we respond to it. How much we try to avoid thinking about death, how we avoid thinking about what death looks like, how we try to avoid the reality of what death looks like.
Hmm.
And just this is 2024 is year 22 for me in fire and EMS, and so going into the days immediately preceding my mother's death, especially after learning some things about grief after my father's death 18 years ago, I sort of knew what to expect. I sort of knew what the stages of grief look like for a lot of people. I knew what it looked like for myself coming out, in the wake of my own father's death a year after that. I think I was still dealing with some of that when you and I met in Antarctica, because maybe, only at that point, it was only 17 months, 16, 17 months after he died.
Oh, wow.
And so just having been so exposed to death over my career, and having been repeatedly exposed to the trauma of whether it's the patient that died, the scene of the death, or more so what I've needed therapy for, the immediate grief reactions of family and friends afterwards.
Hmm.
That sort of helped me prepare myself for what I was going to expect when grief hit me.
Hmm.
And there were only, for the most part, I went into a survival mode within the first few days of, like probably within the first 30 minutes of hearing my mother died.
Hmm.
Predominantly because a lot of things fell on me. I had to fly home. So I was at work when I found out,
Hmm.
and I only had a 20-minute drive, but I built my flight on orbits driving home. I didn't have time to grieve then.
Hmm.
Then I got home, then I had to immediately start putting bills to my name and start, trying to get into her email account and bank account. So there's a little bit of a grace period before I really started to grieve.
Hmm.
But once I did start to grieve, I sort of knew what to expect, and I sort of knew what I needed to do to not let grief take complete control over me and my emotional expression, especially within my own interpersonal relationships, and take over my life.
Hmm.
So I knew I know what stress looks like to me. I know what anxiety looks like to me. I know how I'm going to react around my friends and family when I am dealing with whatever emotions have the best of me at that time. So it just sort of helped me prepare and maybe stave off some of those outbursts or some of those untoward interactions with my family and friends while
Mhm.
I was grieving.
Mhm. For someone who hasn't experienced, the loss of someone really close to them yet, like, how would you prepare them for that knowing what you know now?
Um, One of the things that I've always outside of death, one of the things I've always had an issue with is imposter syndrome. Um, Maybe, and I've unpacked this a little bit with therapists in the past, maybe because I hold myself to such a high standard and I am constantly increasing the stakes by which I perform my job. My job as a paramedic, my job as a firefighter, my job as a soldier,
Mhm.
um, like all these things that I identify myself with.
Mhm.
That if I don't live up to the standard I set forth for myself, I tend to attack myself. I tend to tear myself down for it.
Mhm.
Um, so I've learned what that looks like, and I've learned how that presents itself. Excuse me. And one of the things that I think we all do, regardless of our jobs, regardless of the standards we hold ourselves to, is we tend to tear ourselves down when we're facing the death of a loved one, the death of a friend or a family member, a parent, whatever. And we're always looking back to see what could I have done better in our relationship? What could I have done better in the days, weeks, months leading up to the death? Like, how was I not enough for this person?
Mhm.
So there are a lot of feelings of guilt that you sometimes feel. I mean, it's part of the grieving process. There's a lot of feelings of guilt
Mhm.
that you end up feeling. And one of the things, and I was very open about my grief and my emotions on Facebook.
Mhm.
I post a lot on Facebook. I have a very active presence on social media. And so one of the things that helped me be present with myself and not just like sulk and not just hide away was to say, hey, this is what I am dealing with. This is what my mother meant to me. This is how I'm processing my grief. And
Mhm.
in response to that, one of the best things, the best advice that I kept hearing over and over and over again from people who have lost parents, who have lost loved ones before, and it's something I also believe, but I just needed to hear it more and more from others,
Mhm.
was to be kind to myself. And it's very hard, especially when you already live a lifestyle or you have a professional lifestyle. Like I said, for me, where you are holding yourself to a high standard, anything less than that, no matter the how slight or how minuscule that mistake is, you tear yourself down for. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Mhm.
So just simply being patient with yourself, giving yourself some grace, being kind to yourself,
Mhm.
learning how to do that before you have to deal with the death of a loved one will help with will help program you how to deal with that when you're dealing with like such an insurmountable guilt of whatever it is that has you feeling guilty about a death.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of things I look back and like, my mother and I had a great relationship. We loved each other. My mother was proud of me. She was always talking about me to friends and families. And so
Mhm.
when I take a step back to really process my guilt, I realize, at least objectively, I realize that like this is very unfounded. Like all my guilt right now is very unfounded. This is just me trying to tear myself down because
Mhm.
it's one of the ways I was processing it. So learning how to give yourself grace right now when you don't have the grief guilt that I was feeling,
Mhm.
that you will feel when you do lose someone really close to you, will go a long way.
Mhm.
And also preparation, just stuff like a will, like knowing how to get into someone's house if you don't have a key, like knowing how to access, email accounts, bank accounts, like just all those little things you may not necessarily think about
Mhm.
that you have to do when someone dies. So like there's a lot of sort of what we're talking about, what I was talking about a few minutes ago, where there was a few days I didn't have time to grieve because I had a lot
Yeah.
of shit to get done.
Yeah.
Like I got to get in the house, I got to make sure the power doesn't go out, I got to plan a funeral. Like there's so
Mhm.
much stuff that no matter how much you want to grieve and how much a death affects you, you have to get done. So
Mhm.
like just planning for that can help lessen your burden, lessen your stress, because no matter how much I'd like to say I didn't have time to grieve, there's still some stuff brewing underneath. There's still grief brewing underneath, and it's just going to compound on the stress that you're feeling when you're trying to handle the everyday adult tasks that you need
Mhm.
in the immediate wake of someone's death.
Yeah, which in itself, those details are quite tedious, especially end of life and
Yeah, then
funerals and yeah.
exactly.
So, um, so how do you actually do that? How do you actually take it easy on yourself? Do you stop yourself mid-thought? Like if we were inside your head, how are you easier on yourself? Is it a habit? Like what do you do?
I between my own therapist and just a lot of the somatic experiences, like somatic therapy that I've tried before, especially like mindfulness and meditation. Really, the only two somatic therapy practices that have really ever worked for me.
Mhm,
It's taught me how to be, um, and it's a word I used to hate with a passion. It taught me how to be present with myself.
mhm,
And I always thought of that as something that's like a loaded term, vague, sort of vapid at times, that's just sort of predominant with the healing community.
mhm,
And there's there's a reality to its concept. Being able to take a step back and, this is something I do, like being able to take a step back and just simply ask yourself, why am I thinking this? What does this truly mean? Like, is this like how is this thought right now either relevant to a situation at hand or is it even practical for me?
mhm,
And whenever I feel myself going down a negative rabbit hole when I'm thinking about who I am, when I'm trying to measure who I am as a insert title here, father, soldier, firefighter, man, whatever. Like
mhm,
I I have to take a step back and be like, what is driving me to think X, Y, and Z? Is this
mhm,
is this social programming? Is this, like I said, the standards I hold myself to at work? Is this grief? Is this happy? Is there a specific emotion that is driving me to think the thoughts that I am right now?
mhm,
And I also will take a time. I'll take a second to ask myself, are these thoughts realistic? Like, is this a realistic portrayal of who I am? Does this realistically represent my work ethic, like my accomplishments, my performance today, like my performance this week, the
mhm,
success of my relationships, the success of my life overall?
mhm,
And so like I said, I used to balk at the concept of being present and mindfulness, but like it really does help. It really does help make you stop and make you really critically think about your own feelings towards yourself, if that
mhm.
makes sense.
Oh yeah, that makes total sense. And that level of awareness, I think, is I mean, that's what I do
Yeah.
for the fire service is teaching that or just making people aware that their stream of thoughts isn't just an automatic playlist that they then act out and live out, right? Because if
Mhm.
we don't stop and question, we'll just be it, like we'll just embody it, right? We'll believe it,
Yeah.
we'll believe our own thoughts. And so just that little bit of gap of like, whoa, whoa, whoa,
Mhm.
you know, hold on a
And
second, I think is really valuable.
it is, and it's funny that no matter how much you practice it, like, it'll still pop up, like, those moments where you second guess yourself, where you tear yourself down, like, it'll still pop up. Like, I remember, this is a long time ago, it's probably, like, the 3rd or 4th work and fire I ever drove on as a pump operator, and I was 20 years old. I was a
Hmm.
20-year-old engine operator, and I remember it was a very long response to, like, apartment complex that was fully involved, that was under construction. And it was one of the most challenging pump operations I ever had to do with. I was supplying another engine as well as a ladder truck, and I made the huge mistake, something I will never forget. Don't ever use dry erase marker on the side of your pumper because it'll eat through your coat. It'll eat through the clear coat of your engine, of your paint.
Oops.
And so like all the formulas and all my math was just enshrined on
Hmm.
the side compartment door of our engine
Oh
for like
my
the next
God.
4 years until we sold it. And thankfully the math was right because I did not want to hear that for 4 years.
Hmm.
But like that was one of the times where I really felt like proud of myself and like feeling I felt capable as a pump operator. That was like my own personal test. It was like, yeah, I think I know what I'm doing because I was pretty nervous when even after the training I went through when I got released.
Hmm.
Um, but that was overshadowed but the car I almost creamed just by, doing a little California stop through a stoplight. And
Mhm.
like that was something, despite how well I performed on the fireground, despite the first true test of my of being able to critically think under extreme stress, besides everything else that went right, that one small mistake, which even our engine officer was like, these things happen. Like, it was, I didn't even see that car coming.
Mhm.
Um, that one small mistake, like, just stuck in my head for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Mhm.
And I tore myself down despite all of the other positive things that happened, despite the accolades I got as a brand new driver. Like that one tiny thing just made me feel that that imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
I made an internal mistake, a mental mistake, performing an RSI back in June, and I caught myself, and I redid my med math, and the med math came out correctly. And it was a very, very critical call. It was two women that were hit, that were struck by a vehicle downtown Boise Saturday night in front of 100 people. It was a hit and
Wow.
run at 40 miles an hour,
Wow.
and it was a very public call, and it felt so weird to be congratulated and patted on the back when I'm like, no, I'm a fucking idiot. Like I made this huge medical mistake, in the back of my head, even though I corrected myself right then and there, and like I kept on with it. But again, like I just tore myself down for a week and a half later over this one minor mistake that I fixed, that I corrected. I recognized the mistake and then I corrected it. And I was
Mhm.
like, why the hell do we do this as humans?
Mhm.
So yeah, like no matter how much I practice it, no matter how much I try to be cognizant of how badly I tear myself down over just the most minor mistakes, I still do it.
Mhm. Let's layer in being a guy into this conversation.
Oh
Uh,
shit, yeah.
how much do you think it's because you're a man that you do this to yourself, and
Um,
the social programming of that?
I think it's a lot. I was raised, even though I grew up in the suburbs, my mother's side of the family, they were deeply Baptist. They grew up in the South. She came from a family of sharecroppers, and they're they're a tough family. They've lived through a lot, and just coming from that deep South um, religious background, there's a lot that's put onto the shoulders of us as men. And my dad grew up in Philadelphia in the 30s and 40s,
Mhm.
and similar thing. It was a similar thing, just living in a poor area of Philadelphia. There's a lot that's riding on the shoulders of us as men,
Mhm.
and it sort of permeated into my career as a firefighter. I mean, I started volunteering at 17, got my first career job at 20, and it permeated permeated into my career as a firefighter, especially in the East Coast.
Mhm.
And it's something that again I had to really learn where a lot of the drive to be stoic, to be um, firm in my mental health without having to say I need help with my mental health. It took a lot for me to recognize like where a lot of that came from. And again, in the early 2000s, that's when at least back then, I don't think we didn't have the social pressure for a lot of us as men to get help when we needed it.
Mhm.
When we experience trauma, whether it's trauma through a call, whether it's physical trauma, when we are experiencing relationship issues, when we're experiencing marriage issues, whatnot, it just that impetus wasn't there. And like, thankfully, it's 2024, and especially within the fire service, there's a lot more there's a lot more social, not, I shouldn't say social pressure. I don't want to say that we're pushing people to get
Mhm.
mental, to focus on our mental health. There's a lot more social encouragement,
Mhm.
especially among us as men, to increase our increase our awareness of our mental health. We still have a long ways to go. Still have a long ways to go, but at the same time, we're now seeing more and more data as to what our what our lives are like with mental illness. We're seeing more and more data about, hey, these are the suicide rates, these are the increased mortality, morbidity rates for us in the fire service, for us in EMS, for us in the military, when it comes to our mental health, and that has helped me be a little bit more open, and it also drives me to be open. It drives me to do interviews like this with you, where I can
Mhm.
openly talk about like, hey, like these are things I've struggled with since I was 20 years old,
Mhm.
and I'm 39 now. So 19 years of my career, like these are things I struggled with. And now I have no problem going to a therapist the second I need it. The second I even recognize that the potential for trauma, for long-term trauma exists within a call, I'll go straight to a therapist. But it's also something that I really love talking about because I don't feel that even in the wake of the social encouragement for all of us to be more mindful of our mental health, I don't feel enough of us are talking about it, especially enough of us guys.
Mhm.
And it sucks because I've lost a lot of friends to suicide. I've lost a lot of friends. Or I shouldn't say lost a lot of friends, but I've watched a lot of my friends walk away from a job they love because they didn't feel that it was in the best interest of their mental health because they didn't have the resources to take care of post-traumatic stress disorder or any of the other trauma that they were experiencing within their career.
Mhm.
Um, so it's like I said, now I think being a man isn't as it's not the it's still a critical factor, but it's not as big of a factor leading up to my own my mental health hangups, as
Mhm.
it was when I first got into the job in 2002, 2003, 2004, like those early 2000s, if
Mhm.
that makes sense.
Oh yeah. It's a the whole new it's a whole new game, I think, in the fire service. Um, yeah, just because I started in '96.
Mhm.
So, and I remember somebody telling me once, like, it's only sexual harassment if you don't enjoy it.
Yeah, like shit like that.
And stuff like that. And, I what do you think it's really gonna take though? Do you think like we're on the right path to change the suicide statistics, or do you think there's an additional step that needs to come in for things to really make you know an everlasting shift in the fire service?
I think more of this, more more representation from um firefighters, from EMTs, from whomever.
Hmm.
I hate the phrase in the trenches, but like people who are working on the line,
Hmm.
people who are out in the field, saying like, hey, these are the real experiences that I have. This is what I'm going through. And also seeing representation of people that others can relate to. Again, more men talking about like, hey, this is the shit that I'm dealing with in my career. These are
Hmm.
the traumas that are constantly plaguing me. These are the steps that I'm taking to be more mindful about my mental health, to take care of myself mentally, emotionally, spiritually, if that's something else you need. Um, it's funny, as we think about this, I think about a moment with you. I think about, do you remember when Travis got run over at McMurdo, like day two of all of us being on the ice in Antarctica?
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
was that was 2008. I distinctly remember that. That was my very first shift of the summer season
Hmm.
in Antarctica with the Antarctic Fire Department.
Hmm.
And I was lieutenant working that day, and we were at the galley. We were at lunch, and I remember hearing someone scream on the radio for help. And I might have been Christian. I can't remember who it was because Christian was driving the whatever tracked vehicle that was. And we came around, we all ran from the galley to the firehouse, and we saw our friend laying there with a broken femur.
Hmm.
And that was in the wake, that was a month and a half in the wake of one of the hardest things I ever had to deal with, which was the line of duty death of a firefighter on a wildfire in
Hmm.
California. It was pretty infamous line of duty death, the Dutch Creek accident. The firefighter's name was Andrew Palmer. It was his very first fire, his very first season as a wildland firefighter. He was a firefighter
Wow.
with Olympic National Park, and he was struck by a tree limb. It was about 5 feet long, 20 inches diameter. Immediate open fracture of his femur, and he had an uncontrolled junctional hemorrhage from that fracture, and bled to death over the course of 4 hours because no one knew how to pack wounds, and they weren't able to get an ambulance up to him. And in the end, it took a Coast Guard helicopter telling the division supervisor to go pack sand. We don't care if this IFR or not. We're going to hoist him and we're going to take him to the hospital.
Yeah.
He unfortunately went into cardiac arrest in that flight, and he was pronounced dead before they even landed in Reading. But I was on the medevac helicopter because I was working. That was my second season with Zion, or my first season with Zion Helitech. And we
Mhm.
tried multiple times to reach him in our medevac helicopter, and we ended up having to land in elementary school just because we weren't able to make it back to the heli base under instrument flight rules. And
Mhm.
without one of the hardest things I've ever had to deal with in my life was being able to see someone that needed my help, and I wasn't there to help them. I wasn't able to do anything. And that really fucked me up for that summer for about a year and a half after that. And
Mhm.
so a month and a half later, here I am, like 48 hours on the ice, and someone who I've already come to really enjoy his company. Here he is lying on the ground with a fractured femur from getting run over by a vehicle. And I remember talking to all of you in the training room, and I broke down crying. I broke
Mhm.
down crying. I had to like take a step out. I think you broke down crying after looking at me breaking down crying.
Probably.
And who was it? Skip. I remember Skip came into the lieutenant's office like, "Hey, dude, like, you okay? Like, we really need you right now." And I
Mhm.
came back out and I told you guys like, "Hey, you guys just saw me break down. Like, this is really difficult for me. I'm sure it's difficult for you. Like, it's gonna be difficult for all of us. So let's talk about what we need right now." And I look back on that, and I was really glad. It was probably one of the first times I ever demonstrated, "Hey, this is what I'm going through, and it's okay to do this." And I'm sure you guys are going through the same thing. Let's embrace this together, the fact that we're able to be this open, and let's talk about what's bothering us. And I think that's what's needed more in our profession is more people to say, hey, it is okay to not be okay, to say that you're not okay, and to say that you need help. And there doesn't mean you're less of a firefighter, less of a soldier, less of a whatever,
Mhm.
because you still, if you want to do this job, if you want to be able to continue helping people do whatever it is that's driving you to do this career, um, you need to take care of yourself mentally, not just physically, not just professionally through training or whatever. Like your mental health has to be as tip top as your physical fitness
Mhm.
and your professional prowess.
Mhm. Oh yes, so true. And yeah, I was profoundly affected by Travis getting run over. I watched it happen. I don't know how you
Oh,
were
I
at
didn't realize
lunch,
you were
and
there.
I was standing there on the pad.
No shit.
And for our viewers, so Bevans and I, way back when we first met, you were my boss in Antarctica, my first season on the ice. And so yeah, we were just, man, we had just landed, but we had all bonded really closely. And then, one of our own gets run over, right? Just
It was a
backing the
grip
truck
track.
out.
I remember it was a grip track. It was one of the yellow tracks.
It happened. It was so fast too.
Yeah.
It just like I didn't even, nobody expected it. Like he just fell over, and then the track was going over his leg and he's screaming, and it's crazy. So I do think, I agree. I like your perspective of, um, the humanity. I
Mm-hmm.
think really tapping back into the humanity, for each other in those moments.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember debriefing as a group, and I think that was really powerful to kind of band together because he was quickly taken off the ice after that
Yes.
happened.
He was flown off. He was flown off ice the following day.
Yeah, and
Um,
yeah, so
and like I said, like just thinking about it, I wonder what my response to that would have been like hadn't I been dealing with the unresolved trauma of Andrew Palmer's death.
mhm,
Because like I said, even though I wasn't even there in the ground, we still saw him from a distance from the helicopter, and we weren't able to land and help them. And that, like I
mhm,
said, that royally, royally fucked me up. Like the first time I've ever experienced knowing someone had a life or death um, had a life or death injury, and we
mhm,
had the means and the knowledge to help him, but we couldn't get to him.
yeah,
And just seeing someone who again had not a similar injury, but a similar injury, just a different mechanism, like a fractured femur, that did me in. That
mhm,
that that I think made Travis's injury like that much more harder to deal with.
mhm. Oh, I could totally see that. It's just like, yeah, living it all over again, except
Yeah,
different person.
exactly.
Um, so let's kind of, I know, straddling the military and the fire service. Is it any different over on the military side, or do you kind of see the same behaviors, out of the teams there as well, and the same need for just what you described of just more flow of information? between soldiers, or is it different over there?
I so for the sake of disclaimer, I'm in the Idaho Army. I'm in the Army National Guard. I'm not active duty, so a lot of the active duty stressors, even stateside, I don't necessarily have to deal with. But it's still similar in that the capacity for trauma, psychological, emotional trauma, exists within the military as it does in the fire service. If not, probably tenfold.
Hmm.
Um, and the same stressors outside of when you're during your duty day. The same familial stressors because of, say, your work ethic, because of your work hours, because of your presence or lack thereof at home and your family and your relationships. The same financial issues if you're having to deal with them, compounded with um, unresolved trauma, unresolved mental illness, and maybe even a dash of substance abuse, which we see both in the fire service military. It's the exact same over there.
Hmm.
And the military is it's a slow reactionary beast. It's a very slow reactionary beast. And there are nowadays, let's say within the past 10, 15, 20 years, especially in the wake of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as we improve our messaging as a society about mental health and treating mental illness and whatnot, um, there's a slow, ever so slow increase in how much mental health is talked about and how much being open about needing mental health resources within the military. It's slowly increasing.
Hmm.
We still have to deal with a lot of suicide. We still have to deal with a lot of um, mental illness and behavioral illnesses. There's still a lot of unresolved trauma in a lot of soldiers out there, and a lot of other service members out there, not just in the Army or the Army National Guard.
Hmm.
Um, but it's like I said, if you were to ask any soldier regarding discussions by leadership about mental illness now versus say the early 2000s or before, like it's slightly increased,
Hmm.
but we still have a long way to go, and I still think it boils down to um, both soldiers at the low levels and junior, senior NCOs, commissioned officers, talking to the soldiers directly underneath them about their own mental illness, about saying like, hey, this is what I have to deal with at times, and this is how I treat it. And it
Hmm.
is okay to go to therapy. It is okay to not be okay. It is okay to talk about what is bothering you. Because in the end, when you talk about it, you acknowledge it. It's very one of the things I found, and I found a little bit. I do this back and forth over the summers with my mother's death. Um, it's very easy to disassociate from your problems and to sort of let it fester underneath. But if you talk about it, you're forcing yourself to acknowledge its existence. When I say it, grief, whatever emotion you are dealing with, whatever mental illness you are trying to fight, you are trying to treat. If you talk about it, you're acknowledging it. If you
Hmm.
simply ignore it, then that allows you to disassociate it, and then you're simply going to have to deal with how it chooses to bubble up to the surface, regardless if you're conscious that you're aware about it or not.
Hmm.
So having those, I think about my own platoon sergeant who talks about himself needing therapy. I really appreciate that because he's a little bit newer to our platoon as medics.
Hmm.
I'm combat medic for those that didn't catch that.
Hmm.
He's newer to us as our platoon sergeant for our medic platoon. Um, but we've all quickly grown on him. He's grown on us, and we have a lot of respect for him. We care about him a lot, and I see it in our junior medics that they really appreciate when he talks about his experiences. We've had a couple really good company commanders, couple captains, and we had a major who was our company commander for a while, and they've been good about talking about some of their marital issues. When they talk to us as an entire company, here are these grown men talking to 200 some odd soldiers, close to 100 soldiers, about their marital issues and stuff that they've had to do in order to handle their own insecurities and handle their own mental illness, or at least some minor mental illnesses they've had. And it means a lot. It means a lot to those younger soldiers. You may not reach out to everyone, but you might be able to help three, four, five, six, however many soldiers that just needed that one person to say, like, hey, I'm having issues too. And that might be enough to push them to get the help that they need, to take their own mental health seriously, or at least, at very least, to be more aware of what's going on in their head and be a little less willing to disassociate from it all.
Hmm. Well, you have always, in my perspective, been someone who is good at being vulnerable, Bevans. Even, when you were in a superior, you were my superior. Uh, and I've always admired that about you. What do you think? I heard identity and is what is part of what's so powerful about vulnerability. Is there anything else about vulnerability that makes it just really connective on an interpersonal level?
Um, I think going back to what we were talking about, when I was mentioning like how I used to hate the word presence,
Hmm.
and like the healing new age sense of the word. Vulnerability is a loaded phrase, especially among a lot of guys.
Hmm.
We sort of shun vulnerability, but it's something that I feel that we practice even when we don't know that we're practicing it. If you're in a relationship and you are truly trusting in your partner. You're practicing vulnerability. You know that you are capable of being hurt. We're humans. We're all capable of being hurt, psychologically hurt, emotionally hurt. Yet we are choosing to open ourselves up for the sake of our relationship, for the sake of our partner, because it feels good when you feel safe to be as raw and be as open and be as authentic as you can to someone else. Like that feels good. That is vulnerability. It's something we practice in our relationships.
Hmm.
um, I feel it's needed in order for us to truly talk about our mental health and truly talk about our mental illnesses if we're experiencing any, our traumas, etc. We have to practice vulnerability, and it's something that is a scary four-letter word to a lot of people in the fire service as well. Um, but in order for us to truly get a handle on our mental health, much like we might do on our physical prowess as whatever it is that we do for a living, or our physical fitness, if it's important for your job. We got to practice vulnerability. We have to be able to say, like, I need to be open about what I'm feeling. And it's scary. It's scary for a lot of people. It's scary for people to express themselves because they may not want to even acknowledge what's going on in their heads.
Hmm.
B, they may not even want to acknowledge what's going on in their heads to their peers because they're afraid of what their peers are going to think.
Hmm.
C, they may not even want to acknowledge what's going on in their head because for some reason, there's a correlation between getting hurt by someone else, getting hurt by others, and expressing themselves, simply just being open, knowing that whatever it is that they want to express um, could could possibly lead to even more trauma. But regardless, like it's just something we have to practice. And it's something we can't avoid.
Hmm.
Because I feel, at least personally, like my own opinion, the opposite of vulnerability is stoicism.
Hmm.
And stoicism doesn't really get us anywhere. Stoicism leads to even worse mental health. And for some people, it might be the end of their career, if not the end of their lives.
Hmm.
So I don't know what the answer is to how to practice vulnerability. It's taken me years of therapy. It's
Hmm.
taken listening to a lot of conversations like the one we're having now to understand the importance of vulnerability and to understand the how tied vulnerability is to mental health care. But it's something we got to figure out.
Hmm.
Um, I wish I had the answer as to how to make it more palatable to be vulnerable.
Hmm.
All I know is in the end it worked for me, and it's way easier for me to be vulnerable and talk to my friends, talk to my coworkers, families, like, hey, this is what's going on, and it sucks.
Hmm. Yeah, and it bonds us,
Mhm.
Like I still remember that chat we all had after Travis got run over and um yeah, I think it's that shared experience. I think that's what it is. It's like a little white flag of like I'm showing you this wound and do you have one too? And then you
Yeah.
can kind of meet in that. So um and I acknowledge it's, I'm not a dude. I'm a chick, and for us, we were always allowed to say I'm hurt and cry, and then we would get comforted. That was always what we received in exchange for vulnerability. Um, so what did you receive as a little boy when you were vulnerable? I'm just curious.
Um, I think it was well received. It was well received by my parents. Like I didn't like my dad was pretty awesome. Like he was fairly I wouldn't call him stoic because I feel stoicism like you were purposely practicing that. Like I don't think a lot of people are accidentally stoic.
Hmm.
He didn't really like emotionally express himself a lot. Like I never really heard him talk in the sense that I did.
Hmm.
Um, but whenever, and I don't think I did a whole lot either, just simply from my upbringing. But the times that I did express myself, it was never met with negativity. Like it was never suppressed.
Hmm.
Um, I was if it was one thing my parents taught me both from their experience was resiliency, but they did so in a very healthy way, and they did so in a way that I don't resent
Hmm.
or didn't really program like any crazy hangups or insecurities that like I had to work to like stop projecting in my own interpersonal relationships as an adult. Like I feel that I got a good mix of being able to express myself while also that being received well by my parents and also being taught resiliency. Like, hey, this is how you deal with it. Like I said, my mother grew up in a family of sharecroppers in a tiny house in Alabama. She went to segregated schools all her life. My dad grew up in the streets of Philadelphia in the 40s and 50s. Like so both of them, they had a pretty pretty rough, staunch upbringing, and
Yeah.
they succeeded. Like they succeeded with flying colors in their adult lives.
Hmm.
And so I think them being receptive to me being expressive as well as again just learning basic resiliency like that really helped out a lot.
Hmm. Is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you really feel is important to share with our listeners?
Uh Should we talk about a lot? Um I don't know. All I could say is find a therapist and go to that therapist once a month. And what has really helped with me with having the same therapist, which disclaimer, like we talked about, I sort of silent quit my last therapist because they said some problematic things. I was like, I don't know how much I can with this.
Hmm.
But one thing I really appreciated, a really good therapist I had in Virginia that I wasn't able to bring to Idaho because I didn't have an Idaho license, even though we were doing nothing but like telehealth consults.
Hmm.
Um, they learn you. They learn who you are. They get a baseline understanding of who you are, of your mannerisms, of your body language, of your behavior, your vocal tone, like everything about you. So when time comes to really deal with something heavy, they have a significant amount of context behind who you are and how whatever it is that is this heavy that you need to deal with right then and there is affecting you. And I feel that they're able to tailor their therapies and tailor their treatment a little bit better simply because they've gotten to know you over a course of a couple months or a couple years.
Hmm.
Uh, and even outside of that, like just regular therapy helps because you'd be amazed how outside of immediate psychological first aid or whether you even have like PTSD or something like that, you'd be amazed how much you don't realize is going on with you mental health wise until someone just happens to take a step back as you're talking about your feelings, talking about your past, and saying, have you ever realized that you do X, Y, and Z? Have you
Hmm.
ever realized that whenever I say X, Y, and Z, you respond with A, B, and C? Or whenever you talk about X, Y, and Z, you immediately do or say A, B, and C.
Hmm.
And having someone just who professionally looks for those things, it does wonders for you. And it helps you. That's probably why I'm more willing to be vulnerable, more willing to talk about my mental health, more willing to talk to others about, hey, this is what I've had to deal with, this is how this presented for me, and this is what I've done to help myself. Regular therapy. I can't stress it enough.
Hmm. Um, and as we kind of wrap things up, I know you had kind of a resource for us, for our listeners to kind of build on their knowledge base from this conversation. What is that resource you'd like to
Um,
share?
I'm a big fan of the Responder Alliance. I one of the I really like the idea of psychological first aid as a concept. Knowles National Outdoor Leadership School is probably one of the first schools to really teach it as part of a medical certification. Wellness first responder, wellness upgrade for medical professionals, wellness EMT. That is a
Hmm.
part of the curriculum, psychological first aid.
Hmm.
I just happened to stumble upon Responder Alliance because one of our instructors and one of the leads behind our mental health curricula happens to work with the Responder Alliance.
Hmm.
And so I happened to go through the website, and they have a lot of resources for both long-term mental health management as well as psychological first aid for immediate psychological injuries.
Hmm.
And from there, I sort of went down multiple rabbit holes in terms of long-term psychological care and mental health. And Responder Alliance, it revolves around psychological first aid and mental health resources for those that are in public safety, the military, and public safety agencies like ski patrol and search and rescue.
Hmm.
And I think it's just responderalliance.com, common spelling.
Hmm.
If not, you probably look it up in a search engine, like Google it or something like that. But like I said, I can't stress enough. I really love them as a resource, and I read through their stuff a lot just to more so to better my practice as a paramedic, better my practice of psychological first aid for the patients that I come across in the wake of something traumatic.
Hmm.
But it also has helped me personally as I navigate my own mental health.
Awesome. It's
Yeah,
like two birds, one stone there with
exactly.
responder lines. We'll go ahead and put the link in the show notes so you don't have to Google it. I'll link it right there below the video. And thank you, Bevans.
Oh,
It's always, I love our conversations. Thank you for coming on the show today. Any
thank you,
closing
Jess.
thoughts as we wrap up? Anything else you want to say before we log
No,
off?
it was it's I have fun talking about this. I enjoy talking about mental health and mental health care, both as someone who takes it seriously for himself and both as something that we should be practicing as EMS providers, whether you're EMT, whether you're paramedic or whatever. And also as something for us to be aware of for our own peers.
Hmm.
Because sometimes we might be the first ones to recognize a problem before our peers even recognize it in themselves.
Hmm.
So I'm just, thankful to have this opportunity to do this in a podcast. It's pretty cool.
Awesome. Yeah, it was fun. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, so thank you again for coming on, Bevans, and a big thank you to our community members who are still watching. If you're still with us, you're amazing. And as always, my door is always open to you. If you have any comments or feedback you want to share with us, feel free to reach out to me at info@firepowerx.com. And as always, we'll see you in the next episode. Bye, guys.